Sarah arrived at Harold's house in less than 10 minutes, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one. The familiar drive through Oakwood Heights felt surreal. Past the elementary school where she and Marcus had talked about sending their future children, past the coffee shop where they'd shared Sunday morning breakfasts, past the intersection where she'd waited countless times for news from search parties that never found anything. Her hands were visibly shaking as she rang the doorbell, and she had to grip the porch railing to steady herself. Harold opened the door immediately, as if he'd been standing there waiting. Sarah could see the gravity of the situation written in every line of his weathered face, in the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there that morning. "Sarah," Harold said gently, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to prepare yourself. What I found, it's going to be difficult to see." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure anything could have prepared her for this moment. After 11 years of searching, of hoping, of lying awake at night, wondering if Marcus was out there somewhere thinking about her, she was about to see physical evidence of what had happened to him. The unknown was finally about to become known, and that terrified her more than the uncertainty ever had. Harold led her through his modest living room, past the photographs of his late wife Helen, past the recliner where he'd spent countless evenings watching the news and hoping for updates about Marcus's case. The house smelled like the tomato plants he'd been working with that morning, a earthy, living scent that seemed inappropriate for the gravity of what they were about to confront. They walked to his kitchen table, where Marcus's belongings were still spread out exactly as Harold had found them. Sarah stopped in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized items she'd seen Marcus with every day of their married life. It was like seeing ghosts made tangible, pieces of a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, reaching toward Marcus's wallet before stopping herself, afraid that touching it might make it disappear, might prove this was all some cruel dream. "That's really his wallet." Harold nodded solemnly. "His driver's license is inside, along with his credit cards and some cash. Everything looks exactly like it did the day he disappeared. Even the bills in his wallet are the same denominations he always carried, 2 20s, a 10, and a few ones. I remember because he always organized his money the same way." Sarah moved closer to the table, her eyes taking in each item with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. The fitness watch with its cracked display. She'd bought that for his 35th birthday, wrapping it carefully and hiding it for weeks before the surprise breakfast she'd planned. The wedding ring with their initials and anniversary date engraved inside. She'd helped him pick it out when they got engaged, spending hours at the jewelry store debating between different styles until they found the perfect one. The car keys, with the little metal keychain from their honeymoon in Hawaii, a tiny surfboard with "Aloha" etched into it that Marcus had insisted on buying from a tourist shop in Waikiki. She'd teased him about it at the time, calling it touristy and silly, but he'd said he wanted something to remind him of the happiest week of his life. Now that silly keychain was evidence in his murder case. "How?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible, the word catching in her throat. "How were these buried in your yard? How did they get here?" Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Sarah. I've been trying to understand it myself since I found them. I've lived in this house for 40 years, and I never saw anyone digging in my backyard. But someone buried this box. Someone who knew where to hide it so it wouldn't be found. Someone who knew my routines, knew when I was inside, and when I was working in other parts of the garden." The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air between them. Someone had violated Harold's property, had used his backyard as a hiding place for evidence of murder. Someone had watched his house, had studied his habits, had calculated the perfect spot to conceal their crime. Sarah picked up Marcus's wallet with trembling hands, opening it carefully as if it might disintegrate. At her touch, the leather was surprisingly well preserved, protected by the metal box from the elements that should have destroyed it over 11 years underground. Inside, everything was exactly as Marcus would have left it. His driver's license with the photo that had never quite captured his smile properly. His medical license that he'd been so proud of earning. His credit cards arranged in the specific order he always used. There was even a photo of Sarah from their wedding day, tucked behind his insurance card, exactly where she remembered him keeping it. She stared at the wedding photo, remembering the day it was taken. Marcus had insisted on keeping a copy in his wallet, even though Sarah had teased him about being sentimental. "I want to carry you with me everywhere," he'd said, and the memory of those words now brought tears to her eyes. "Sarah," Harold said softly, watching her examine the wallet. "There are other things in the box, things that don't belong to Marcus." Sarah looked up from the wallet, noticing for the first time the items she hadn't recognized. Several small vials of medication with hospital labels, a notebook with handwritten entries, and a letter folded in half. "What are these?" she asked, though part of her already suspected they were connected to Marcus's death in ways she didn't want to understand. "I don't know. I can't read the writing clearly enough to understand what the letter says, and I don't recognize the medications. But Sarah, I think these might be clues about what happened to Marcus. I think whoever buried this box wanted these things to be found together." Sarah picked up the letter with shaking hands, holding it closer to the light so she could read the handwritten text. The handwriting was shaky and difficult to read, as if written by someone whose hands were trembling or under the influence of something. As she read, her face grew increasingly pale, and Harold could see tears forming in her eyes. The letter began without salutation. "I never meant for things to go this far. When I started taking the medications, it was just to get through the stress of the job, just to make it through each day. But it became something I couldn't control, something that controlled me instead." Sarah continued reading, her heart sinking with each line. "Dr. Williams figured out what I was doing. He was always so careful about following protocols, always double-checking everything. I should have known he would notice the discrepancies in the inventory, the missing medications that didn't match the patient records." "What does it say?" Harold asked gently, seeing the distress on Sarah's face. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, reading and rereading the letter, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The words seemed to swim on the page, rearranging themselves into meanings she didn't want to accept. "It's a confession," Sarah finally said, her voice breaking. "Someone wrote about what happened to Marcus, someone who was stealing drugs from the hospital where he worked." She handed the letter to Harold, who put on his reading glasses and examined the text more carefully. The handwriting was shaky, but legible, and as Harold read, he felt his own shock deepening. The letter was unsigned, but it detailed a medical malpractice scheme involving stolen medications and falsified patient records. According to the confession, Marcus had discovered the scheme and was planning to report it to hospital authorities and law enforcement. The person writing the letter claimed they had panicked, had never intended for things to escalate the way they did. "I waited for him that morning," Harold read aloud, his voice growing hoarse. "I knew his jogging route, knew what time he left his house. I just wanted to talk to him, to convince him not to report me, to give me a chance to get help and make things right. But when I approached him, he said it was too late, that he'd already documented everything, that he had a responsibility to protect patients." Harold paused, looking at Sarah, who was now crying openly. "Should I continue reading?" Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue Harold handed her. She needed to know everything, no matter how painful. "Harold," Sarah said, her voice hollow with shock, "this letter says Marcus was murdered because he found out about someone stealing drugs from the hospital. Someone he worked with, someone he trusted." Harold continued reading, his heart sinking, as he absorbed the details. The letter described Marcus being confronted during his morning jog, being forced into the white van Harold had seen that morning. It described a struggle in which Marcus was accidentally killed, and then a cover-up that involved disposing of his body and burying his personal effects. "The white van," Harold said suddenly, looking up from the letter. "The one I saw that morning. This letter mentions a white van, describes it as an older model Ford with rust around the wheel wells. That matches what I remember seeing." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You were right, Harold. You saw the person who took Marcus. You've been carrying that memory for 11 years, feeling guilty about not doing more, and you were right all along." Harold felt overwhelmed by the implications of what they'd discovered. For 11 years, he'd wondered if he could have done something different that morning, if he could have paid more attention to the white van, if he could have somehow prevented Marcus's disappearance. The guilt had eaten at him, making him second-guess every detail, wondering if his memory was even reliable. Now he learned that his observations had been crucial evidence all along. The elderly man who thought he'd failed to help had actually been the key witness to a murder. "Sarah, we need to call the police right away," Harold said, carefully folding the letter. "This letter, these items, they're evidence in Marcus's murder case. But more than that, they're proof that you were right never to give up hope that the truth would come out." Sarah nodded, though she seemed to be in shock. She was still holding Marcus's wedding ring, turning it over in her hands as if she couldn't quite believe it was real, as if touching it might somehow bring him back to her. 11 years, Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible. "For 11 years, I've been wondering what happened to him, where he was, whether he was still alive somewhere, whether he was trying to get back to me. I've imagined every possible scenario, that he had amnesia, that he'd been kidnapped and held somewhere, that he'd chosen to leave and start a new life." She paused, staring at the ring through her tears. "And the whole time, the answer was buried in your backyard. The whole time, he was already gone, and someone was letting me hope for something that could never happen." Harold felt his own eyes, welling up with tears. He'd watched Sarah's anguish for 11 years, had seen her refuse to move from the neighborhood in case Marcus came home, had observed her birthday and anniversary rituals at the park where his fitness tracker was eventually found. Harold called 911, his hands shaking as he dialed. When the dispatcher answered, he took a deep breath and tried to explain the situation calmly. "This is Harold Thompson at 847 Maple Street in Oakwood Heights. I need to report that I found evidence related to the Marcus Williams missing person case from 11 years ago." The dispatcher seemed confused at first. The case was 11 years old, after all. But when Harold mentioned finding the victim's personal belongings and a confession letter, the tone of the conversation changed immediately. "Sir, I need you and the other person to remain exactly where you are and not touch anything else until officers arrive. Do not move any of the items you found. This is now an active crime scene." Within 20 minutes, Harold's quiet street was transformed. Police cars lined both sides of Maple Street, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the peaceful suburban neighborhood. Crime scene tape surrounded Harold's backyard, and investigators in protective suits were photographing and cataloging every inch of the area where the metal box had been buried. Detective Morrison, who had inherited Marcus's case from the recently retired Detective Chen, arrived along with several other investigators and crime scene technicians. He was a tall, serious man in his 40s who had spent years working cold cases and had developed a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail. Detective Morrison examined the contents of the metal box carefully, photographing each item from multiple angles and taking detailed notes about their condition and placement. He read the confession letter multiple times, his expression growing more serious with each reading. "Mrs. Williams," Detective Morrison said, looking up from his notes, "I need to ask you to verify that these items belong to your husband." Sarah nodded, pointing to each item with a shaking finger. "The wallet, the keys, the wedding ring, the fitness watch, they're all Marcus's. I recognize everything. The wallet still has the little tear in the corner from when he caught it on his car door. The wedding ring has our initials engraved inside, MW and SW, with our anniversary date. The fitness watch has that crack in the display from when he dropped it in our driveway. And you've never seen these other items before. The medications, the notebook, the camera." Sarah shook her head. "Those don't belong to Marcus. But the letter," she paused, trying to compose herself. "The letter explains what they are. It says Marcus discovered someone stealing medications from the hospital, and these vials must be evidence of that theft." Detective Morrison made notes as Sarah spoke, his pen moving quickly across the page. "Mrs. Williams, I need you to understand that this letter, if authentic, indicates that your husband's disappearance was the result of foul play. This is now a homicide investigation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though she'd been preparing herself for this possibility for years. Hearing it spoken aloud by a police detective made the reality feel crushing and final. Marcus wasn't missing anymore. He was dead, had been dead for 11 years, murdered by someone who had panicked when he discovered their criminal activity. "Do you have any idea who might have written this letter?" Detective Morrison asked. watching Sarah's reaction carefully. Sarah read through the confession again, looking for any clues about the identity of the person who had written it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there were no names mentioned except Marcus's. But there were details that suggested the writer knew the hospital well, knew Marcus's routines, knew exactly how to cover their tracks. "I don't recognize the handwriting," Sarah said slowly. "But the letter mentions specific details about the hospital, about medication protocols and inventory systems. Whoever wrote this had medical knowledge and access to the hospital's drug supply. They knew Marcus's schedule, knew his jogging route, knew he was the kind of person who would report criminal activity regardless of the personal cost." Detective Morrison nodded, making more notes. "We'll be investigating all of your husband's colleagues, anyone who had access to medications, anyone who might have felt threatened by his integrity and ethical standards." As the crime scene investigation continued, Harold found himself thinking about the person who had buried the box in his yard. Someone had made the decision to hide this evidence on his property, had taken the risk of trespassing in his backyard, to conceal their crime. But why his yard specifically? Why not some remote location where it would never be found? "Detective," Harold said, approaching Morrison carefully, "whoever buried this box chose my yard specifically. They didn't just pick a random location. They knew I lived across the street from Marcus. They knew I'd seen the white van that morning. This feels personal, like they wanted to involve me somehow." Detective Morrison looked at Harold with new interest. "What do you mean by personal, Mr. Thompson?" "I mean someone wanted to make sure I was connected to this crime, even if I didn't know it. For 11 years, I've been living with the memory of seeing that van, feeling guilty that I didn't do more to help. Someone wanted me to carry that burden. Someone wanted me to be haunted by what I'd witnessed." Sarah looked at Harold with new understanding, seeing the psychological torture he'd endured without even realizing it. "You think whoever did this buried the evidence in your yard deliberately? Not just to hide it, but to involve you psychologically?" Harold nodded. "I think whoever killed Marcus wanted to make sure that if the evidence was ever found, it would be found by me. The person who saw him that last morning. The person who's been carrying guilt about not doing more to help." The implications of Harold's theory were chilling. Detective Morrison made detailed notes as the elderly man explained his reasoning, recognizing the psychological sophistication it would have required. "Mr. Thompson, that's an interesting perspective," Detective Morrison said. "If you're right, it suggests that the person responsible for Dr. Williams's death knew you personally, knew about your role as a witness, knew where you lived and what your daily routines were." The implication was terrifying. For 11 years, Harold had been living across the street from someone who had killed Marcus Williams and buried the evidence in Harold's own backyard. The person responsible for Marcus's death wasn't some random criminal. They were someone who knew the neighborhood, knew the witnesses, knew exactly how to hide their crime in plain sight while psychologically tormenting the people who cared about the victim. As the investigation continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening, more neighbors gathered along the police tape, drawn by the unusual activity and the rumors spreading through the community. Many of them remembered the original search for Marcus, remembered the flyers Sarah had posted on every street corner, remembered the prayer vigils and community meetings where they'd discussed safety and looking out for one another. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door to Harold, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I can't believe this was buried in Harold's yard all this time. To think we've all been living so close to evidence of what happened to your husband." Other neighbors shared similar sentiments, expressing shock that such a violent crime had touched their quiet community, that someone among them had been capable of murder and had walked among them for 11 years without anyone suspecting. As the crime scene processing continued, Sarah found herself feeling a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief because Marcus was definitively dead, because the hope she'd carried for 11 years was finally extinguished. But relief because she finally had answers, because the uncertainty that had consumed her life was finally over. "Mrs. Williams," Detective Morrison said, as the evidence collection was being completed, "I want you to know that this discovery changes everything about your husband's case. We now have physical evidence, we have a confession, and we have specific leads to follow. This is no longer a cold case. This is an active homicide investigation with real momentum." Sarah nodded, though she felt emotionally exhausted by the day's revelation. What happens now? How do you find someone who's been hiding for 11 years? Now we follow the evidence systematically. We'll analyze the handwriting, investigate the medication theft angle, and re-interview everyone who was involved in the original investigation. We'll look at hospital personnel records, prescription logs, and anyone who might have had access to the specific medications found in this box. Detective Morrison paused, looking directly at Sarah. Someone killed your husband and buried this evidence, and we're going to find out who. This confession letter contains details that only the killer could have known, and those details will help us identify them. As the police finished their work and prepared to leave Harold's house, Sarah realized that her life was about to change dramatically once again. For 11 years, she'd been the wife of a missing person, living in limbo between hope and despair, unable to move forward, but unwilling to give up. Now she was the widow of a murder victim, with all the painful certainty that designation implied. But she was also, for the first time in 11 years, moving forward instead of standing still. The questions that had haunted her had finally been answered. The mystery that had consumed her life had finally been solved. And somewhere in Oakwood Heights, or perhaps far away by now, a killer was about to discover that their 11-year-old secret was no longer safely buried in Harold Thompson's backyard. The discovery of Marcus Williams's belongings in Harold Thompson's backyard made national news within 48 hours, but the story's reach extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Cold case breakthrough. Missing doctor's effects. Found after 11 years ran as the headline in newspapers across the country, but the story was picked up by cable news networks, true crime podcasts, and social media influencers who specialized in missing persons cases. The case had everything that captured public attention. A beloved community doctor who had vanished without a trace, a devoted wife who never gave up searching, an elderly neighbor who made a shocking discovery while planting tomatoes, and a confession letter that revealed a murder motivated by prescription drug addiction. It was the kind of story that made people feel both horrified by the crime and hopeful that justice might still be possible, even after so many years. Sarah found herself thrust back into the spotlight she'd grown accustomed to in the early years, after Marcus's disappearance. But this time, everything was different. Instead of pleading for information about a missing person, she was answering questions about a murder investigation. Instead of holding on to hope that Marcus might still be alive, she was processing the reality that he'd been dead for 11 years. The media attention was overwhelming. News crews parked outside her apartment building, their satellite trucks blocking the small parking lot where she'd learned to recognize every car belonging to her neighbors. Reporters called her phone constantly, some offering exclusive interview opportunities, others simply wanting a quote about how it felt to finally have answers. Her social media accounts, which she'd kept active for years as a way to spread awareness about Marcus's case, were flooded with messages from strangers offering condolences, sharing their own stories of missing loved ones, and proposing theories about who might have killed her husband. "I can't believe you never gave up hope," wrote one message. "You're an inspiration to all of us who are still searching for our missing family members." Another said, "I've been following your husband's case for years. I'm so glad you finally have answers, even though they're not the answers you were hoping for." But this time felt different for Sarah in ways that went beyond the media attention. Instead of the desperate energy that had driven her during the early years of Marcus's disappearance, she felt a strange combination of exhaustion and determination. She was tired from 11 years of uncertainty, but she was also focused on ensuring that whoever had killed Marcus would be held accountable. Detective Morrison assembled a task force to reinvestigate Marcus's case, bringing in fresh eyes and new resources that hadn't been available during the original investigation. The confession letter found in the buried box provided specific leads that hadn't existed before, and advances in forensic technology meant that evidence could be analyzed in ways that weren't possible 11 years earlier. The letter mentions a systematic theft of controlled substances from Mercy General Hospital, Detective Morrison explained during a press conference held at the police station. "We're working with hospital administration to audit their pharmacy. Records going back 12 years, looking for patterns of missing medications that might correspond with the timeline mentioned in the confession. The press conference was packed with reporters from local and national media outlets, all of them asking questions about the investigation's direction and timeline. Detective Morrison was careful not to reveal too many details that might compromise the case, but he wanted to assure the public that the investigation was being taken seriously. "We're treating this as an active homicide investigation," Morrison said in response to a question about resources being devoted to the case. "The discovery of Dr. Williams's belongings and the confession letter has provided us with more concrete leads than we've had in 11 years. We're committed to following those leads wherever they take us." One reporter asked about the significance of the burial location in Harold Thompson's backyard. "Do you believe the killer chose that location deliberately to involve Mr. Thompson?" Detective Morrison considered his words carefully. "We're exploring all possibilities regarding the burial site. Mr. Thompson was a crucial witness in the original investigation, and the location where the evidence was found may be significant to understanding the perpetrator's motivation." After the press conference, Detective Morrison and his team began the painstaking process of re-examining every aspect of Marcus's case with fresh perspective and new evidence. The confession letter provided a roadmap of sorts, outlining a motive and method that investigators hadn't previously considered. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, who had been Marcus's closest colleague and had cooperated fully with the original investigation, found herself being re-interviewed as both a witness and a potential suspect. The letter's details about hospital procedures and medication protocols suggested that whoever wrote it had intimate knowledge of Mercy General's operation. "Jennifer," Detective Morrison said during their interview at the police station, "you worked closely with Dr. Williams in the emergency department. Did he ever mention concerns about missing medications or irregularities in the hospital's pharmacy protocols?" Jennifer shook her head, but her expression suggested she was thinking carefully about the question. "Marcus was very conscientious about following protocols, more so than most doctors. He always double-checked medication orders, always verified dosages, always made sure his documentation was complete, but he never mentioned any specific concerns about theft. The confession letter suggests that Dr. Williams was planning to report someone for stealing drugs. Would he have confided in you about something like that?" Jennifer considered the question carefully, remembering her colleague's personality and professional ethics. Marcus was ethical to a fault, but he was also methodical. If he discovered someone stealing medications, he would have felt obligated to report it, yes. But he also would have been careful to verify his suspicions before making accusations. He wouldn't have rushed to judgment or acted on incomplete information. Detective Morrison made notes as Jennifer spoke, appreciating her insights into Marcus's character and professional approach. Who else would Dr. Williams have trusted with sensitive information? If he was planning to report a colleague for theft, who might he have discussed it with first? Sarah, probably. Maybe Dr. Peterson, the hospital administrator. Marcus had a good relationship with hospital leadership and respected the chain of command. There was also Dr. Amanda Foster, the psychiatrist who consulted on some of our more difficult cases. Marcus sometimes sought her advice about ethical dilemmas, and he respected her judgment. The detective added these names to his growing list of people to interview. The investigation was expanding beyond Marcus's immediate colleagues to include anyone who might have had knowledge of his discovery or felt threatened by his integrity. "Jennifer, I need to ask about your colleagues in the emergency department. Was there anyone whose behavior seemed unusual in the weeks or months before Dr. Williams disappeared? Anyone who seemed stressed, paranoid, or behaved differently than normal?" Jennifer thought for several minutes before responding. "There were always people under stress in the ED. It's a high-pressure environment. But..." She paused, seeming to recall something. "Actually, there was Dr. Kellerman, the anesthesiologist who sometimes worked with us on trauma cases. He seemed increasingly anxious in the months before Marcus disappeared. I remember thinking he looked tired all the time, like he wasn't sleeping." "Well, Dr. Richard Kellerman?" "Yes. He was a good doctor, very skilled, but he seemed to be struggling with something personal. His hands sometimes shook during procedures, which was unusual for someone with his experience. I assumed it was stress or maybe personal problems, but..." Detective Morrison leaned forward with interest. "What?" "Now that I think about it, his behavior changed pretty dramatically right after Marcus disappeared. He seemed almost relieved, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. At the time, I thought maybe he was just glad the uncertainty was over. But looking back, it seems strange. The detective made detailed notes about Dr. Kellerman, recognizing that this was potentially significant information. An anesthesiologist would have extensive access to controlled substances and would understand hospital protocols well enough to carry out systematic theft. Meanwhile, forensic experts were analyzing the confession letter, trying to determine its authenticity and identify its author. The handwriting analysis would take time, but preliminary examination suggested that the letter had been written by someone under significant stress, possibly while intoxicated or under the influence of medication. The handwriting shows signs of tremor and inconsistent pressure, the forensic expert explained to Detective Morrison during their consultation. This could indicate that the writer was elderly, ill, or affected by substances. The letter formation suggests medical training. The way certain pharmaceutical terms are written indicates familiarity with medical terminology. The expert continued, "The paper and ink are consistent with materials available 11 years ago, which supports the timeline described in the letter. There are also indications that the writer was left-handed and possibly wore gloves while writing, which might explain some of the awkward letter formations." Detective Morrison found this information particularly interesting. Someone had been careful enough to wear gloves while writing the confession, suggesting premeditation and awareness that the letter might someday be analyzed for fingerprints. As the investigation expanded, Detective Morrison's team began examining hospital records from the period leading up to Marcus's disappearance. What they discovered supported the confession letter's claims about systematic medication theft at Mercy General Hospital. Pharmacy records showed patterns of missing controlled substances dating back to the period before Marcus's disappearance, with discrepancies that had never been properly investigated. The missing medications included opioids, benzodiazepines, and other drugs that would be valuable on the black market or for personal use by someone struggling with addiction. We found documentation of several incidents where medications were signed out but never administered to patients, Detective Morrison explained to Sarah during one of their regular updates. The hospital treated these as clerical errors at the time, but the pattern suggests systematic theft by someone who understood the documentation system well enough to cover their track. Does this help identify who might have written the confession letter? Sarah asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time since the discovery. We're narrowing down the list of people who had access to these medications and the knowledge to carry out this kind of theft. It requires someone with medical training, someone who understood hospital protocols, someone who had regular access to the pharmacy or medication storage areas. The investigation was also examining the burial site in Harold's backyard more thoroughly, looking for additional evidence that might have been missed during the initial discovery. Crime scene technicians found traces of other materials buried near the metal box, fragments of clothing that didn't match anything Marcus had been wearing, soil samples that didn't match the surrounding area, and traces of chemicals that might have been used to conceal odors. The burial site was carefully planned, Detective Morrison told Sarah during another update. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They buried the box deep enough that it wouldn't be discovered accidentally by casual gardening, but not so deep that it would be impossible to retrieve if necessary. You think they might have planned to come back for it? Sarah asked, disturbed by the implication. It's possible. Or they might have wanted to ensure that if it was discovered, it would be discovered by someone specific, namely, Mr. Thompson. The psychological aspect of burying evidence in the yard of a key witness suggests sophisticated planning and, possibly, a desire to torment those involved in the case. Harold Thompson, meanwhile, was dealing with his own emotional trauma from the discovery. The elderly man who had spent decades maintaining his garden as a source of pride and peace now found his backyard the center of a murder investigation, his sanctuary transformed into a crime scene. I keep thinking about all the years I spent out there, Harold told Sarah during one of her visits to check on him. All the times I was gardening, planting flowers, pulling weeds, not knowing that Marcus's things were buried just a few feet away. It makes me feel like I was living in someone else's crime scene without realizing it. Harold's distress was understandable. For 11 years he had tended his garden as a way of maintaining normalcy and finding peace in his retirement. Now, every memory of working in his backyard was tainted by the knowledge that evidence of murder had been hidden beneath his feet. Sometimes I wonder if I sensed something, Harold continued, his voice shaking slightly. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, when I felt like something was wrong in the neighborhood. I always attributed it to getting older, to missing. Helen, but maybe some part of me knew that something terrible had happened. Sarah tried to comfort Harold, but she understood his distress. The discovery had transformed his sanctuary into a reminder of violence and deception. The beautiful garden he'd maintained for decades was now forever associated with the darkest chapter of their neighborhood's history. As spring turned to summer, the investigation continued to intensify. Detective Morrison's team had identified several potential suspects, hospital employees who had access to medications and knowledge of Marcus's work habits. They were conducting interviews, analyzing financial records, and building psychological profiles of people who might have felt threatened by Marcus's discovery of their criminal activity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, just as Harold's discovery had been unexpected. Dr. Amanda Foster, the psychiatrist Jennifer Hayes had mentioned during her interview, contacted Detective Morrison with information that would change the entire direction of the investigation. But her decision to come forward hadn't been easy. It required her to break the sacred trust of doctor-patient confidentiality. "I need to speak with you about Marcus Williams," Dr. Foster said during their phone call, her voice tight with stress. "There's something I should have mentioned years ago, but I was bound by doctor-patient confidentiality. But given what's been discovered, given that a confession letter has been found, I think I need to break that confidentiality in the interest of justice." Detective Morrison arranged to meet Dr. Foster at the police station the following morning. When she arrived, she was carrying a thick file folder and looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her decision to potentially violate patient confidentiality was clearly weighing heavily on her conscience. "Detective," Dr. Foster began, settling into the chair across from Morrison's desk. "About 6 months before Marcus disappeared, I was treating a patient who worked at Mercy General Hospital. This patient had severe addiction issues and was stealing medications from the hospital to support their habit." Detective Morrison leaned forward with interest, recognizing that this could be the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. "What kind of medications were they stealing?" "Primarily opioids and benzodiazepines, exactly the types of controlled substances mentioned in that confession letter you found. My patient had developed a sophisticated system for covering up the theft, manipulating inventory records, and falsifying patient documentation." Dr. Foster opened her file folder, revealing pages of handwritten notes from therapy sessions. "The theft had been going on for nearly 2 years. My patient would take medications that were supposed to be administered to patients, but would falsify the records to make it appear that the drugs had been given as prescribed." "Why didn't you report this at the time?" Detective Morrison asked, though he understood the ethical complexities involved. Dr. Foster looked uncomfortable, clearly struggling with the implications of her decision. "Doctor-patient confidentiality is sacred in psychiatric treatment. My patient was trying to get clean, was attending sessions regularly, and claimed to have stopped stealing medications. I believed that treatment was more effective than criminal prosecution, that helping them recover would ultimately protect more people than destroying their career. But something changed. Yes. My patient became increasingly paranoid as their recovery progressed. They started expressing fears that someone at the hospital was suspicious of them, that they were being watched, that their theft had been discovered." Detective Morrison felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of escalation that could lead to violence. "Did they mention Dr. Williams specifically?" Dr. Foster nodded gravely, her hands shaking slightly as she turned pages in her file. "In our last session, about 2 weeks before Marcus disappeared, my patient said they were convinced that Dr. Williams had figured out what they were doing. They were terrified that he was going to report them, that their career would be ruined, that they would go to prison." She paused, reading from her notes. "My patient said, and I quote, 'Dr. Williams is too ethical for his own good. He won't let this slide, won't give me a chance to make things right. He's going to destroy my life over this.'" There was real desperation in their voice, a kind of panic that worried me. Detective Morrison was writing furiously, recognizing the significance of this information. "What was your patient's name?" Dr. Foster hesitated for a moment, then opened her file folder completely. "Dr. Richard Kellerman. He was an anesthesiologist at Mercy General." Detective Morrison wrote the name down carefully. Dr. Richard Kellerman. An anesthesiologist would have extensive access to controlled substances and intimate knowledge of hospital protocols. He would also have the medical knowledge referenced in the confession letter. Dr. Foster, is Dr. Kellerman still your patient? No. He stopped coming to sessions right after Marcus disappeared. I tried to reach out to him multiple times. Left voicemails, sent letters, but he never responded. I assumed he had found another therapist or decided to handle his recovery on his own. Where is he now? I don't know. I heard through hospital colleagues that he left Mercy General shortly after Marcus's disappearance, but I don't know where he went. Detective Morrison immediately began investigating Dr. Richard Kellerman's background and whereabouts. What he discovered was deeply disturbing and seemed to confirm their suspicion. Kellerman had indeed left Mercy General Hospital just 3 weeks after Marcus's disappearance, citing personal reasons and family obligations for his sudden resignation. He had sold his house in Oakwood Heights within a month of leaving the hospital and had moved out of state without leaving a forwarding address with his colleagues or the hospital administration. More significantly, Detective Morrison discovered that Dr. Kellerman had lived just 4 blocks away from Harold Thompson's house, close enough to know the neighborhood well, close enough to have observed Marcus's jogging routine, close enough to know exactly where to bury evidence that would implicate Harold if it was ever discovered. We need to find Dr. Kellerman, Detective Morrison told his team during their daily briefing. He's our primary suspect now, and his disappearance right after the murder suggests consciousness of guilt. The search for Richard Kellerman proved more challenging than expected. He had effectively disappeared after leaving Oakwood Heights, using cash transactions when possible and avoiding any activities that would create a paper trail. His medical license had lapsed in the state where he'd previously practiced, and there was no record of him obtaining licensure anywhere else. Detective Morrison's team used database searches, credit reporting agencies, and law enforcement networks across multiple states to try to locate Kellerman. They discovered that he had briefly worked at a clinic in Nevada under his real name, but had left that position after only 6 months and had again disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Sarah struggled with the revelation that Marcus's killer had been someone he worked with, someone he had trusted professionally. The idea that a colleague, another doctor who had taken the same oath to do no harm, had murdered her husband was almost incomprehensible. I remember Dr. Kellerman, Sarah told Detective Morrison during one of their meetings. He came to our Christmas party in 2012, just a few months before Marcus disappeared. He seemed nice enough, quiet, a little awkward socially, but polite. He brought a bottle of wine and spent most of the evening talking to Marcus about work. She paused, trying to recall more details about that evening. Actually, now that I think about it, he asked a lot of questions about Marcus's schedule, about his jogging routine, about how early he got up in the morning. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, maybe thinking about starting his own exercise routine. But now, Detective Morrison made notes about this interaction. What else do you remember about Dr. Kellerman? Did Marcus ever mention him specifically? Marcus talked about work a lot, but he rarely mentioned individual colleagues unless something significant happened. He did say once that Dr. Kellerman seemed to be under a lot of stress, that he seemed tired and distracted during procedures. Marcus was always concerned about his colleagues' well-being. He would notice if someone seemed to be struggling. The handwriting analysis of the confession letter came back with results that supported the new theory about Kellerman's involvement. The forensic expert determined that the letter had been written by someone with medical training, based on the terminology used and the way certain pharmaceutical names were written. The handwriting also showed signs of someone under the influence of medications, which was consistent with Kellerman's addiction issues, as described by Dr. Foster. The letter shows characteristics consistent with someone experiencing withdrawal or under the influence of opioids, the expert explained to Detective Morrison. The tremor in the handwriting, the inconsistent pressure, the occasional breaks in letter formation, these are all consistent with someone whose fine motor control was impaired by substance use. More importantly, the expert was able to compare the confession letter to medical records that Kellerman had written during his time at Mercy General. While the confession letter was obviously written under duress and while impaired, There were enough similarities in letter formation and writing style to suggest that the same person had written both documents. 2 months after Harold's discovery, Detective Morrison's team finally located Richard Kellerman living under an assumed name in a small town in Montana. He had been working as a maintenance worker at a local clinic, using false identification, and living in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. The investigation that led to Kellerman's discovery involved cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies and required months of painstaking detective work. The breakthrough came when Kellerman was hospitalized after a drug overdose and was forced to provide identification to hospital staff. The alias he was using was flagged in a database search, and Montana authorities were contacted. When Montana law enforcement officers arrested Kellerman at his apartment, they found him in possession of several bottles of stolen prescription medications and multiple notebooks containing what appeared to be detailed confessions to Marcus Williams's murder. The notebooks contained information that only the killer could have known. Details about how Marcus had been forced into the white van, how he had struggled and been accidentally killed during the confrontation, how his body had been disposed of in a location that would never be found. Most disturbingly, the notebooks revealed that Kellerman had specifically chosen to bury Marcus's belongings in Harold Thompson's backyard as a form of psychological torture for the witness who had seen too much. He had watched Harold for weeks after the murder, studying his routines and finding satisfaction in the elderly man's obvious guilt and distress. "I wanted him to suffer," Kellerman had written in one of the notebooks. "He saw me that morning, saw the van, and I knew he would always wonder if he could have done something to save Dr. Williams. I wanted him to carry that guilt forever, to know that he had failed when it mattered most." Detective Morrison called Sarah with the news of Kellerman's arrest, his voice reflecting both relief and sadness at finally solving the case. "Mrs. Williams, we've apprehended the person responsible for your husband's death. Dr. Richard Kellerman is in custody in Montana and has confessed to killing Marcus. He'll be extradited back here to face murder charges." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the killer had been caught, anger at the senseless loss of her husband's life, and profound sadness that Marcus had died trying to do the right thing by reporting criminal activity. "How did you find him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. "He was hospitalized after a drug overdose and was forced to provide identification. The addiction that drove him to steal drugs and kill your husband has clearly consumed his life over the past 11 years. He's been living under false names and working menial jobs, but the addiction followed him wherever he went." Detective Morrison continued. "We found multiple notebooks in his possession containing detailed confessions about what happened to Marcus. He's been carrying the guilt of what he did, but instead of turning himself in, he's been slowly destroying himself with drugs and self-hatred." "Will he be extradited back here for trial?" Sarah asked. "Yes. The district attorney's office is preparing murder charges, and Dr. Kellerman will be brought back to face justice for what he did to your husband. The evidence against him is overwhelming. His own confessions, the physical evidence, his connection to the medication theft, and his disappearance right after the murder." The arrest of Richard Kellerman made national news, bringing renewed attention to Marcus's case and highlighting the issue of prescription drug addiction among medical professionals. The story of how a respected anesthesiologist had murdered a colleague to cover up his drug theft shocked the medical community and prompted discussions about how to better identify and help healthcare workers struggling with addiction. The trial of Dr. Richard Kellerman began 18 months after Harold Thompson discovered the buried evidence in his backyard, but the legal proceedings had been delayed multiple times due to Kellerman's deteriorating mental and physical health. The man, who had once been a respected anesthesiologist, was now a shadow of his former self, ravaged by years of drug addiction and consumed by guilt over his crime. The case had attracted national attention, not just because of the dramatic discovery that broke it open, but because it highlighted the devastating consequences of prescription drug addiction among medical professionals. News outlets across the country covered the trial, and the courtroom was packed every day with reporters, legal observers, and members of the community who had followed the case for over a decade. Sarah attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row of the courtroom gallery. She had thought long and hard about whether she wanted to face Marcus's killer in person, but ultimately decided that she needed to look Richard Kellerman in the eye and try to understand how someone who had shared the same profession as her husband could have taken his life. Kellerman looked nothing like the composed anesthesiologist Sarah remembered from their Christmas party years earlier. He was thin and pale, his hair prematurely grey and thinning, his hands shaking constantly from withdrawal or medication. The expensive suits he had once worn to work had been replaced by an ill-fitting public defender's suit, and his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of years of self-destruction. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Chen, built their case methodically around the physical evidence found in Harold's backyard and Kellerman's own extensive confessions. D.A. Chen was a seasoned prosecutor who had handled many high-profile cases, but he later said that the Marcus Williams case was one of the most straightforward he had ever presented to a jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," D.A. Chen said in his opening statement, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom, "This case is about a man who chose murder over accountability. Dr. Richard Kellerman was stealing controlled substances from Mercy General Hospital to feed his addiction. When Dr. Marcus Williams discovered this theft and planned to report it, Dr. Kellerman made the decision to silence him permanently. The prosecution presented evidence of Kellerman's systematic theft of medications, showing how he had developed an elaborate scheme to cover his tracks by falsifying patient records and manipulating inventory systems. They demonstrated that Kellerman had been stealing thousands of dollars worth of opioids and other controlled substances over a period of nearly 2 years before Marcus discovered the scheme. Expert testimony revealed that Kellerman had been diverting medications intended for post-surgical patients, leaving those patients to suffer with inadequate pain management while he fed his own addiction. The scope of his theft was staggering. Pharmacy records showed that he had stolen enough medication to supply a small clinic, all while maintaining his professional reputation and colleagues' trust. Dr. Jennifer Hayes testified about Marcus's character and his commitment to ethical medicine, her voice breaking as she described her colleague and friend. "Marcus was the most principled doctor I ever worked with," she said from the witness stand, looking directly at the jury. "If he discovered someone stealing medications, he absolutely would have reported it. He would have seen it as his duty to protect patients and maintain the integrity of the medical profession. That's just who he was. He couldn't compromise on ethics, even when it put him in danger." The prosecution also called several patients who had been treated by Kellerman during the period when he was stealing medication. Their testimony was heartbreaking. They described experiencing severe pain after surgery, being told their pain medication had been administered when it hadn't been, and suffering needlessly while Kellerman used their medications to feed his addiction. Harold Thompson, now 79 and moving slowly with the aid of a walker, testified about seeing the white van on the morning of Marcus's disappearance. Despite his age and some memory difficulties, Harold's recollection of that crucial morning remained sharp and detailed. "I saw Dr. Williams jogging down the street like he did every morning," Harold said, his voice steady despite his obvious emotional distress. "And I saw that white van parked along the curb with someone sitting inside. The person was watching Dr. Williams, and I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know what to do about it." Harold's testimony was particularly powerful because he described the guilt he had carried for 11 years, feeling responsible for not doing more to help Marcus that morning. "I should have paid more attention, should have gotten a license plate number, should have called the police when I saw someone watching Dr. Williams," Harold said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "If I had acted differently, maybe Dr. Williams would still be alive." The prosecutor assured Harold that he had done nothing wrong, that his testimony had been crucial to solving the case, but the elderly man's pain was evident to everyone in the courtroom. Dr. Amanda Foster testified about her treatment of Kellerman and his increasing paranoia about being discovered. Her testimony was particularly damaging because it revealed that Kellerman had been planning to confront Marcus weeks before the murder actually occurred. Dr. Kellerman became convinced that Dr. Williams was investigating him, Dr. Foster testified, reading from her session notes. He expressed fears that his career would be ruined, that he would face criminal charges, that his life would be destroyed if his addiction and theft were discovered. But rather than seeking help or turning himself in, he became increasingly focused on silencing Dr. Williams. Dr. Foster's testimony revealed that Kellerman had spoken about Marcus obsessively during their final therapy sessions, describing him as the biggest threat to everything I've worked for, and saying that something has to be done about Dr. Williams before he destroys me. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from forensic experts who had analyzed the confession letter and other evidence found in Harold's backyard. The handwriting analysis definitively linked Kellerman to the confession letter, and DNA evidence found on some of the buried items confirmed his involvement in the crime. The defense team, led by public defender Maria Santos, faced an almost impossible task. They didn't dispute that Kellerman had killed Marcus. The evidence was overwhelming and their client had confessed multiple times, but they attempted to argue that the killing had been unpremeditated, the result of a drug-addicted man's panic and desperation, rather than a calculated murder. Richard Kellerman is a sick man, Santos argued in her opening statement, gesturing toward her client, who sat slumped in his chair at the defense. Addiction is a disease that destroyed his judgment and led him to make a terrible decision in a moment of panic. This was not premeditated murder. This was a tragic accident that occurred when addiction overcame reason. The defense called several addiction specialists who testified about the effects of long-term opioid abuse on decision-making and impulse control. They argued that Kellerman's addiction had impaired his ability to think clearly, and that his actions were the result of desperation rather than calculated malice. However, the prosecution's case was simply too strong. The confession letter found in the buried box detailed how Kellerman had planned to confront Marcus during his morning jog, how he had purchased a gun specifically for the confrontation, and how he had waited in the white van Harold had observed. The level of planning and premeditation was undeniable. According to Kellerman's own written confession, which was read aloud in court, he had followed Marcus for several days before the murder, studying his jogging route and timing his run. On the morning of the murder, Kellerman had parked his van along Marcus's usual route and waited for him to approach. When Marcus jogged past the van, Kellerman had gotten out and confronted him, demanding that Marcus agree not to report the medication theft. According to the confession, Marcus had refused, saying that he had already documented the theft and that he had a professional obligation to report it. Dr. Williams told me that patient safety was more important than my career, Kellerman had written in his confession. He said that I had violated the trust of every patient I had ever treated, and that he couldn't allow me to continue putting people at risk. He was going to report me regardless of what I said or did. The confession continued with Kellerman's description of how he had forced Marcus into the van at gunpoint, intending to drive him somewhere private where they could continue their conversation. But Marcus had fought back, attempting to escape and calling for help. I never meant to kill him, Kellerman had written. I just wanted to make him understand, to give him a reason not to report me. But when he tried to grab the gun, it went off. The shot hit him in the chest, and he died almost immediately. But the prosecution argued that even if the shooting had been accidental, Kellerman's subsequent actions proved his criminal intent. Rather than calling for medical help or reporting the shooting, Kellerman had driven Marcus's body to a remote location and disposed of it. He had then returned to bury Marcus's personal belongings in Harold's backyard, specifically choosing that location to psychologically torment the witness who had seen. The burial location was particularly damning, evidence of premeditation and malice. Kellerman's notebooks, found at the time of his arrest, contained detailed descriptions of his decision to bury the evidence in Harold's yard. I wanted the old man to suffer, Kellerman had written. He saw me that morning, and I knew he would. Always wonder if he could have done something different. I wanted him to carry that guilt for the rest of his life, to know that he had failed when it mattered most. The psychological torture inflicted on Harold demonstrated a level of cruelty that went far beyond what could be explained by addiction or desperation. Kellerman had deliberately chosen to involve an innocent elderly man in his crime, using Harold's guilt and compassion as weapons against him. This was not a moment of panic, D.A. Chen argued during his closing statement, his voice rising with controlled anger. This was a calculated decision to silence the one person who threatened to expose Dr. Kellerman's criminal activity. The defendant planned this murder, carried it out, and then spent 11 years covering it up while an innocent family suffered without answer. The prosecutor continued. Dr. Kellerman had multiple opportunities to make better choices. He could have sought help for his addiction, He could have reported himself to hospital administration. He could have entered a treatment program. Instead, he chose to steal medications from patients who needed them, and when Dr. Williams threatened to expose his crimes, he chose murder. The defense's closing argument focused on Kellerman's addiction and mental health issues, arguing for leniency based on his disease and his obvious Maria Santos painted a picture of a man who had been destroyed by addiction and was now consumed by guilt over his actions. Richard Kellerman knows what he did was wrong, Santos argued. He has lived with the guilt of killing Dr. Williams for 11 years, and that guilt has destroyed him more thoroughly than any prison sentence could. He is not the same man who committed this crime. He is a broken, remorseful shell of his former self. But the jury was not moved by the defense's arguments. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, they returned a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and concealment of evidence. When the verdict was read, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Marcus back or restore the 11 years of uncertainty she had endured. Kellerman showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting silently at the defense table with his head down. He had expected the guilty verdict and had told his attorney that he deserved whatever punishment the court imposed. During the sentencing phase, which took place 2 weeks after the verdict, Sarah was given the opportunity to address the court with a victim impact statement. She had spent weeks preparing her remarks, trying to find words that could express the magnitude of what Kellerman had taken from her and from the community. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her emotional turmoil. "Dr. Richard, Kellerman didn't just kill my husband. He stole 11 years of my life by denying me the truth about what happened to Marcus. He forced me to live in limbo, never knowing whether the man I loved was alive or dead, whether he was suffering somewhere, whether he might come home someday." Sarah turned to look directly at Kellerman, who sat with his head down, unable to meet her eyes. "Marcus was trying to protect patients by reporting your drug theft. He died because he believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. You chose to silence him, rather than face the consequences of your actions. And in doing so, you proved that you were never worthy of the medical profession he served with such honor." She paused, gathering her thoughts for her final words, thinking about the 11 years of birthdays and anniversaries and holidays she had spent wondering if Marcus was alive somewhere, hoping against hope that he might return. "I hope that during your time in prison, you think about the patients who trusted you, the family who loved Marcus, and the community that has been devastated by your selfish choices. I hope you understand that addiction is not an excuse for murder, and that the oath you took to do no harm meant something more than just words on a piece of paper." Harold Thompson also addressed the court, describing the psychological torture he had endured for 11 years without knowing that the evidence of Marcus's murder was buried in his own backyard. "Dr. Kellerman didn't just kill Dr. Williams," Harold said, his voice shaking with emotion. "He also tortured me by making me unknowingly complicit in hiding the evidence of his crime. For 11 years, I have tended a garden that was really a grave marker, not knowing that the answers to Dr. Williams's disappearance were buried beneath my..." Judge Patricia Williams, no relation to Marcus, sentenced Kellerman to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In explaining her sentence, the judge noted the premeditated nature of the crime, the psychological torture inflicted on both Sarah and Harold, and the violation of trust inherent in a doctor murdering a "Dr. Kellerman, you violated the most fundamental trust of the medical profession," Judge Williams said, looking directly at the defendant. "You took an oath to do no harm, but you chose to murder a colleague whose only crime was trying to protect patients from your criminal behavior. Your actions have damaged the reputation of all medical professionals and caused immeasurable pain to the victim's family and community." The judge continued, "Your addiction does not excuse your crime. Many people struggle with addiction without resorting to theft, and even fewer resort to murder. You had resources and opportunities to seek help, but instead, you chose to escalate your criminal behavior, culminating in the murder of an innocent." After the sentencing, Sarah felt a sense of closure she hadn't experienced in over a decade. The questions that had haunted her for 11 years had finally been answered. The person responsible for Marcus's death had been held accountable. The chapter of her life defined by uncertainty and searching was finally over. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was approached by reporters asking how she felt about the verdict and sentence. "I'm grateful that justice has been served," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "But no amount of justice can bring Marcus back or restore the years we lost together. I hope that other families dealing with missing loved ones can find some comfort in knowing that sometimes, even after many years, answers do emerge and justice can still be achieved." She continued, "I also hope that this case serves as a warning to others in the medical profession who might be struggling with addiction. There are resources available to help, and seeking help is always better than allowing addiction to destroy lives. Marcus died trying to protect patients, and I hope his death leads to better support systems for healthcare workers who are struggling." Harold Thompson, who had attended every day of the trial despite his advanced age and health issues, approached Sarah as the crowd of reporters and legal observers began to disperse. "Sarah," Harold said, his voice shaky with emotion, "I want you to know how sorry I am that it took so long to find the truth. If I had dug in that corner of my yard years earlier, if I had been more suspicious about things I might have known." Sarah cut him off with a gentle smile, placing her hand on his arm. "Harold, you have nothing to apologize for. You were the key to solving this case. Your memory of that white van, your willingness to share what you saw with police, and ultimately, your discovery of the evidence. None of this would have been possible without you." "You've carried guilt for 11 years that wasn't yours to carry. Dr. Kellerman is the only one responsible for what happened to Marcus. You were an innocent witness who ended up being the instrument of justice." Harold nodded, tears in his eyes. "I just wish Dr. Marcus could have known how much we all cared about finding." "I think he did know," Sarah replied. "And now he can rest in peace." Moving forward, 2 years after Richard Kellerman's conviction, Sarah Williams established the Dr. Marcus Williams Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and funding research into prescription drug addiction among medical professionals. The foundation became Sarah's full-time commitment, giving her a sense of purpose that had been missing since Marcus's. The foundation's first major project was creating a comprehensive database of resources for families dealing with missing loved ones, providing them with practical guidance on working with law enforcement, organizing search efforts, and coping with the psychological trauma of not knowing a loved one's fate. "One of the hardest things about having a missing family member is not knowing where to turn for help," Sarah explained during the foundation's inaugural fundraising event. "Law enforcement does their best, but they're often overwhelmed and under-resourced. Families need support, guidance, and hope, and that's what we're trying to provide." The database included information about search and rescue organizations, legal resources for families navigating the complex issues surrounding missing persons, and psychological support services for dealing with the unique trauma of ambiguity. Sarah also worked with Mercy General Hospital and other healthcare institutions to implement new safeguards against medication theft, including enhanced inventory tracking systems, mandatory counseling resources for medical staff struggling with substance abuse issues, and anonymous reporting systems for healthcare workers who witness suspicious behavior. "Marcus always believed that good could come from tragedy if we were willing to learn from it," Sarah said during a presentation to the state medical board. "His death exposed serious problems in our healthcare system's handling of addiction among medical professionals. By addressing these problems, we can prevent other families from experiencing what we went through." The foundation also funded research into the psychological and professional factors that contribute to substance abuse among healthcare workers, recognizing that the high-stress environment of medical practice could make practitioners particularly vulnerable to it. Harold Thompson, now 81 and dealing with increasing mobility issues, became an unexpected advocate for cold case investigations and community vigilance. Despite his age, he worked with local law enforcement to encourage other elderly residents to report anything unusual they might have observed, emphasizing that details that seemed insignificant at the time could prove crucial years later. "You never know what small thing you've seen that might be important," Harold would tell community groups during his presentations, his voice still strong despite his physical frailty. "I saw a white van and thought nothing of it. 11 years later, that observation helped solve a murder case and brought justice to a family that had been suffering for over a decade." Harold's presentations were particularly effective because he spoke from personal experience about the importance of being observant and the value of community involvement in public safety. He emphasized that being a good witness didn't require her. It just required paying attention and being willing to share information with authorities when something seemed unusual. Harold also transformed his backyard into a memorial garden for Marcus, replacing the area where the evidence had been buried with a beautiful flower bed featuring a small plaque honoring Marcus's memory and commitment to ethical medicine. The memorial garden became a place of peace and reflection, visited by many community members who wanted to. The plaque read, "In memory of Dr. Marcus Williams, whose commitment to ethical medicine cost him his life, but whose legacy continues to protect patients and inspire healthcare professionals. Do no harm was not just his oath, but his way of life." The case became a subject of study in criminal justice programs across the country, highlighting the importance of preserving physical evidence, the value of community witnesses in solving crimes, and the challenges of investigating cases involving professionals who use their expertise to commit and Detective Morrison, who had led the investigation, often spoke at law enforcement conferences about the techniques used to solve the Marcus Williams case and the importance of never giving up on cold cases are never really cold, Detective Morrison would say during his presentations. They're just waiting for the right piece of evidence or the right witness to come. The key is never giving up and always being ready to act when new Sometimes the breakthrough comes from sophisticated forensic technology, but sometimes it comes from an elderly man planting tomatoes in his backyard. Detective Morrison also emphasized the importance of building trust with community members and treating every witness with respect, regardless of how insignificant their information might seem at the time. Dr. Jennifer Hayes left Mercy General Hospital 2 years after Kellerman's conviction, citing the trauma of learning that a trusted colleague had been capable of murder and had been stealing medications from the patients they were supposed to be helping together. Working in the same hospital where Marcus was killed, knowing that his murderer had walked those same halls and worked alongside us, became too difficult, Dr. Hayes explained. Every time I saw the pharmacy where Kellerman stole, every time I walked past the locker room where Marcus changed into his scrubs, I was reminded of what we had lost and how we had failed to protect him. She moved to a smaller practice in another state, but maintained contact with Sarah and continued to support the. She also became an advocate for better mental health and addiction resources for healthcare workers. Marcus's death taught me that we can never really know the people we work with, Dr. Hayes said during a presentation to medicals. But it also taught me that his example of integrity and ethical behavior is more important than ever. We have to be willing to speak up when we see wrongdoing, even when it's difficult, even when it involves people we like and respect. The white van that Harold had observed was eventually located in a salvage yard in another state, where it had been sold for parts shortly after Marcus's murder. While little physical evidence remained after 11 years, the discovery provided final confirmation of the details in Kellerman's confession and helped investigators close the last remaining questions about the case. Marcus's body was never recovered, despite extensive searches based on information from Kellerman's confessions and notebooks. The killer claimed to have disposed of it in a remote area that had since been developed into a shopping complex, making recovery impossible. Sarah eventually accepted that she would never have her husband's physical remains to bury, but she found peace in knowing the truth about his death and in the memorial garden that Harold had created. She held a memorial service at the garden on the anniversary of Marcus's disappearance each year, attended by colleagues, friends, and community members who wanted to honor his. On the 5th anniversary of Harold's discovery, Sarah and Harold returned to the spot in Oakwood Park, where Marcus's fitness watch had been found 11 years earlier. They placed flowers and stood in, remembering the man whose commitment to doing the right thing had cost him his life, but whose legacy continued to make a. I still miss him every day, Sarah said to Harold as they walked slowly back through the park, Harold using his walker, but still determined to maintain his But I'm grateful that we finally know what happened to him, and I'm proud that his death led to changes that might prevent similar tragedies. Harold nodded, walking steadily beside her despite his age and physical. Dr. Marcus was a good man who died trying to protect people. That's how he should be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who stood up for what was right even when it put him in danger. As they reached the park entrance, Sarah looked back one more time at the trail where her husband had taken his final. The path was busy with other runners and walkers, people pursuing their own fitness goals and finding peace in the rhythm of exercise and fresh. Life had moved on, as it always does, but the memory of Dr. Marcus Williams lived on through the foundation bearing his name, the safety protocols implemented in his honor, and the commitment of those who knew him to continue fighting for truth and. The case of the Black Doctor who vanished while jogging had finally been solved, not through sophisticated forensic techniques or dramatic police work, but through the simple act of an elderly man planting tomatoes in his backyard. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come from the most ordinary moments, and sometimes the answers we seek are buried right beneath our feet, waiting for the right moment to be. Sarah Williams learned to live with both the pain of her loss and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. She never remarried, choosing instead to dedicate her life to helping other families find the answers she had searched for so desperately. In doing so, she ensured that Marcus's legacy would be not just the mystery of his disappearance, but the positive change that emerged from finally solving it. The neighborhood of Oakwood Heights returned to its quiet suburban routine, but residents never forgot the lesson of Dr. that evil can hide behind respectable facades, that addiction can drive people to unthinkable acts, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find its way. And Harold Thompson continued tending his memorial garden, now with the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in soil marked by tragedy, and that from the darkest secrets can emerge the brightest hope for justice and healing. The garden became a symbol not just of Marcus's memory, but of the power of ordinary people to uncover truth and bring closure to those who. Years later, when Harold was no longer able to tend the garden himself, community volunteers took over its maintenance, ensuring that Marcus's memorial would continue to bloom long after those who had known him. The story of Dr. Marcus Williams became part of the neighborhood's history, a reminder that justice may be delayed, but need never be denied, and that even the most carefully buried secrets cannot remain hidden forever.